The night I found out I was legally declared dead, I was very much alive, standing in a dimly lit rented room in a city where no one knew my name, stirring a cup of tea with trembling hands as rain tapped softly against the cracked window. And for a moment I thought the lawyer on the phone had made a mistake, because how could someone be dead on paper while breathing in reality? How could a life be erased without a funeral, without a body, without even a goodbye? But his voice was calm, almost bored, as he explained that a death certificate had been officially registered under my name 3 months ago and that based on that document, all the property my grandfather had left me had already been transferred to my parents. And I remember my fingers tightening around the cup as the heat burned my skin, yet I didn't feel it, because something inside me had gone completely cold. My name is Sanaa. I'm 26 years old. And that was the moment I realized that in my own family story, I was not a daughter, not a person, but an obstacle that needed to be removed. And the worst part was not the fraud, not the stolen property, but the quiet, calculated way they had done it, as if my existence was nothing more than a small inconvenience they could simply erase. And as I stood there listening to the rain, memories began to replay in my mind, moments that once felt warm but now twisted into something darker, because everything had started just a few months ago when my grandfather passed away, the only man who had ever truly seen me, truly understood me. And when his will was read, the entire house fell silent, because he had left everything to me, not to my father, not to my brother, but to me alone. And I remember the way my mother smiled that day, her hand gently squeezing mine as she said, "We're happy for you, Beta." And my father nodded with pride in his eyes. But now, standing in that small room, I realized those smiles were nothing but masks, carefully placed to hide the storm that was already forming behind them, because soon after that day, things began to change in ways I didn't question at first. My documents started disappearing one by one, my passport, my ID card, even some legal papers related to the property. And when I asked, my mother would casually say, "You're so careless, Sanaa. You must have misplaced them." And I believed her, because why wouldn't I? They were my parents, the people I trusted more than anyone else in the world. But then came the bank notifications, transactions I had never made, money slowly vanishing from my account. And when I confronted my father, he laughed it off, saying it must be a banking error, that these things happen all the time. And again, I let it go, because trusting them was easier than questioning them, until that phone call shattered everything. And as the lawyer's words echoed in my ears, I felt like I was watching my own life from a distance, like I had already become a ghost in their world. And without even realizing it, I picked up my phone and called my mother, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear the ringing. And when she answered, her voice was calm, normal, as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't signed away my existence. And I remember asking her, my voice barely above a whisper, "Amy, did you declare me dead?" And there was a pause, just a second, but it was enough for me to understand everything. And then she spoke, her tone soft but firm. "It was for your own good. You wouldn't understand." And in that moment, something inside me broke completely, because those words carried no guilt, no hesitation, only justification, as if erasing me was an act of care. And I didn't argue, I didn't scream, I just ended the call and stood there in silence, realizing that the people who were supposed to protect me had chosen to destroy me instead. And over the next few days, the truth unfolded piece by piece like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I discovered that the death certificate had been signed using forged medical records, fake witness statements, and even a fabricated hospital report claiming I had died in an accident that never happened, a death that never occurred. And yet it was real enough for the system, real enough for the law, real enough for my parents to take everything that belonged to me. And as I sat on the cold floor of my room that night, staring at the ceiling, I realized that I had two choices. I could disappear completely, accept the role they had written for me, become the ghost they wanted me to be, or I could come back, not as the daughter they betrayed, but as someone they would never see coming, someone who would take back not just the property, but the truth they had tried so hard to bury. And as the rain outside grew heavier, I made a decision that would change everything, because if my own family had declared me dead, then maybe it was time for me to stop being the person they thought they knew, and become something far more dangerous, something they could never control. And that night, in that small, silent room, Sanaa died and someone else was born. The next morning, I didn't wake up as the same person who had gone to sleep the night before, because something fundamental had shifted inside me. Something colder, sharper, more aware, as if the version of Sanaa who trusted her family had quietly disappeared, leaving behind someone who understood that survival wasn't about emotions anymore but about control. And as I sat on the edge of my narrow bed staring at the faint light creeping through the curtains, I realized that if the world believed I was dead, then I had an advantage no one could take away from me, because dead people don't get questioned, they don't get watched, and they don't get expected to fight back. And for the first time since that phone call, I felt something close to power, but it wasn't enough to simply exist in hiding. I needed to understand exactly how far my family had gone, how carefully they had planned this, and most importantly, where they had made their first mistake, because no matter how perfect a lie seems, there is always a crack somewhere, and I was going to find it. So I started small, using the one thing they had overlooked in their rush to erase me completely, my mind, because while they had stolen my documents, my identity, and my property, they hadn't taken my ability to think, to observe, to connect the pieces they had tried to scatter, and within hours, I had mapped out the timeline of everything that had happened over the past 3 months, from the moment my grandfather's will was announced to the day my death was registered, and the more I looked at it, the clearer it became that this wasn't a sudden decision. It was planned, calculated, and executed with terrifying precision. My documents didn't disappear randomly. They were taken deliberately. My bank transactions weren't errors. They were controlled withdrawals, and that death certificate wasn't just a piece of paper. It was the final step in a chain of lies that had been carefully built to make my disappearance look natural. And as I followed this chain in my mind, one question kept repeating itself over and over again. How did they think they would get away with this forever? Because eventually, someone would have noticed, someone would have questioned it, unless they were counting on the one thing that had always been true about me, that I would stay silent, that I would avoid conflict, that I would choose peace over confrontation. And that realization hit me harder than anything else, because it meant they hadn't just stolen my life, they had used my own nature against me, turning my kindness into their greatest weapon. And for a moment, I felt that familiar pain rising again, the betrayal cutting deeper than I could explain. But this time, I didn't let it consume me, I let it shape me, because pain, when controlled, becomes something else entirely, something dangerous. And with that thought, I reached for the only physical proof I still had left, the sealed letter my grandfather had entrusted to his lawyer, the one thing my parents hadn't been able to touch. And as I carefully opened it, my hands slightly trembling despite everything, I felt as if he was still there, watching, guiding me through the chaos they had created, his handwriting steady and familiar as my eyes moved across the page. And with every word, a new layer of truth unfolded. He had known this could happen, not the exact details, not the method, but the possibility that greed could turn family into strangers. And in that letter, he hadn't just given me reassurance, he had given me direction. Subtle hints about legal safeguards, references to documents and witnesses I hadn't even known existed, and most importantly, a reminder that truth, no matter how deeply buried, always finds a way to surface. And by the time I finished reading, the confusion that had clouded my mind since that night was gone, replaced by something much clearer, a plan, because now I wasn't just reacting to what they had done, I was preparing for what I was about to do. And the first step was simple. I needed to prove that I was alive, not publicly, not yet, but legally, quietly, in a way that would force the system to acknowledge the flaw in their story. So I began reaching out, carefully, anonymously, to people who could help me rebuild my identity piece by piece. An old contact from college who worked in digital records, a distant acquaintance who had connections in legal offices, people who didn't know the full story but could unknowingly become part of it. And as the day turned into night again, I felt a strange sense of calm settling over me, because for the first time since everything fell apart, I wasn't lost anymore. I was moving, step by step, towards something bigger than just reclaiming what was mine. I was building a case, a reality that would be impossible for them to deny. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I could almost see it, the moment when their carefully constructed lie would collapse in front of them, when the daughter they had buried without a grave would walk back into their lives, not as a victim, but as a consequence. And as I turned off the light and lay back in the darkness, listening to the faint sounds of the city outside, I allowed myself one final thought before sleep finally took over. They believed I was gone. They believed they had won. But what they didn't realize was that by declaring me dead, they hadn't ended my story. They had only given me the perfect way to begin it again. By the third day, I had stopped thinking like a victim and started moving like someone who had nothing left to lose, because when the world believes you are dead, fear loses its power over you. And as I sat in a quiet internet cafe at the corner of a crowded street, hidden behind an old screen and a name that didn't belong to me anymore, I began tracing the first real crack in the lie my family had built. Because no matter how carefully they had planned everything, they had still relied on systems, on people, on signatures and timestamps, and those things always leave behind evidence. And it didn't take long before I found something that didn't add up. The hospital where my death was supposedly recorded had no actual admission record under my name, only a late entry that had been uploaded weeks after the date mentioned on the certificate, which meant one thing: someone had inserted it after the fact. And as that realization settled in, a slow, controlled smile appeared on my face for the first time since all of this began, because that was it. That was the mistake. The one loose thread that could unravel everything if I pulled it carefully enough. But I knew better than to rush, because this wasn't just about proving them wrong. It was about exposing them completely, in a way they could never recover from, and that required patience, precision, and above all, silence. So I saved every file, every timestamp, every inconsistency I could find, building a digital trail that would later become my strongest weapon. And as I worked, I couldn't help but think about them, sitting comfortably in that house, walking through rooms that no longer belonged to them, living a life they had stolen from their own daughter, probably believing that the worst was over, that I was gone for good. And that thought didn't just hurt anymore, it fueled me, because betrayal like this doesn't deserve forgiveness. It demands consequences, and I was going to make sure they faced every single one of them. But before I could bring them down, I needed to understand exactly who had helped them, because my parents alone couldn't have pulled this off. They didn't have the knowledge or the connections to forge legal documents, manipulate hospital records, and transfer property without raising suspicion, which meant there was someone else involved, someone who had guided them through this process, someone who thought they would never be exposed. And that's when I remembered the lawyer, the one who had called me that night, the one who had casually informed me of my own death as if it was just another file on his desk. And something about his tone, his indifference, didn't sit right with me. So I decided to start there, digging into his background, his past cases, his connections, and it didn't take long before I found a pattern: small irregularities in property transfers, clients who had gained assets under questionable circumstances, cases that had been quietly closed without much attention. And suddenly, everything made sense. He wasn't just a lawyer. He was part of a system that thrived on manipulation, on exploiting legal loopholes and desperate people, and my family had become one of his clients, or maybe his partners. And the more I uncovered, the clearer it became that this wasn't just a personal betrayal anymore. It was something bigger, something darker. And for a brief moment, I felt a flicker of doubt, because going against my family was one thing, but going against someone who knew how to twist the law itself was something else entirely. But that doubt didn't last long, because I reminded myself of the one thing they had all underestimated: me. The girl they thought would never fight back, the daughter they believed they could erase without consequences. And with that thought, I made my next move, something small but significant. I created a new identity online, a presence that didn't connect back to Sanaa in any obvious way. And through that identity, I reached out to the lawyer, pretending to be a potential client, someone interested in complex property transfers, someone willing to pay for discretion. And when he responded, almost immediately, with the same calm professionalism I remembered from that night, I knew I had him, because people like him don't question opportunity, they welcome it. And as our conversation began, I carefully guided it, asking the right questions, offering just enough information to keep him interested, while silently recording every word, every suggestion, every hint of the illegal methods he was willing to use. And with each message he sent, he unknowingly stepped deeper into the trap I was setting for him. and by the time I closed the chat, my heart was racing, not from fear, but from anticipation, because for the first time since all of this started, I wasn't just reacting, I was controlling the game. And as I walked out of the cafe into the cool evening air, the city, lights reflecting off the wet streets, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, certainty, because now I had a direction, a path that would lead me straight to the truth, and eventually, straight back to them. But this time, I wouldn't be the girl they betrayed. I would be the reason their entire world came crashing down, and as I disappeared into the crowd, just another face among thousands, one thought echoed clearly in my mind. Their lie had lasted 3 months, but the truth was already catching up, and when it finally reached them, it wouldn't just expose what they did, it would destroy everything they had built on top of it. A week later, I stood across the street from the house that once belonged to my grandfather, the house that now legally belonged to the people who had declared me dead, and for a moment, I couldn't move, because no matter how much I had prepared myself for this, nothing could truly prepare you for the feeling of watching your own life continue without you, as if you had never existed in the first place. And from where I stood, I could see the front gate slightly open, the same gate I used to run through as a child, the same porch where my grandfather would sit every evening, waiting for me with a soft smile and a cup of tea, and now, everything looked the same except it wasn't, because the warmth was gone, replaced by something colder, something new, unfamiliar. And as I forced myself to take a step forward, pulling my hood lower to hide my face, I reminded myself why I was here. This wasn't about memories, it was about truth, about gathering the final pieces I needed to bring everything crashing down, and as I walked closer, my heart began to pound harder with each step, not out of fear, but out of something deeper, something more dangerous, anger, controlled but burning steadily inside me, because every brick of that house, every corner, every room, carried a part of me, and yet the people inside had erased me as if I meant nothing. And just as I reached the gate, I heard voices, familiar voices, my mother's soft tone and my father's heavier, more authoritative one. And instinctively, I froze, staying just out of sight as I listened. Everything is settled now, my father said, his voice calm, almost relieved. No one is going to question it anymore, and my mother replied, Bias ala ka shakar haiku wo chali gai. Warna yes sab kabi possible nahi hoda. And those words hit me harder than anything else, not because of what they meant, but because of how easily she said them. As if my existence had truly been nothing more than a problem to solve. And, for a split second, I felt that old pain rising again. The urge to walk in, to confront them, to scream and demand answers, but I stopped myself, because that was exactly what they expected from the old Sanaa. Emotional, reactive, easy to dismiss, and I wasn't that person anymore. So instead, I stepped back into the shadows and waited, watching as they eventually moved inside, leaving the gate open behind them. And that was my moment. I slipped in quietly, my movements slow and careful, every sense alert, because despite everything, this was still their territory now, and I couldn't afford to make a mistake. And as I entered the house, a wave of memories crashed over me. The smell of the walls, the faint creak of the floorboards, even the way the light filtered through the windows. It was all the same, and yet it felt completely touche, as if I was walking through a place that had been stolen not just physically, but emotionally. And I didn't let myself linger. I moved straight toward my grandfather's study, the one room they were least likely to have changed, the one place where he had kept things that mattered. And as I stepped inside, my eyes immediately went to the old wooden desk, still standing in the corner, untouched, and for a moment, I felt a strange sense of relief, because it meant they hadn't found everything. They hadn't uncovered all the secrets he had left behind, and quickly, I began searching, my hands moving with purpose as I opened drawers, checked behind books, scanned every inch of the room, and then, just as I was about to give up, I found it, a hidden compartment beneath the desk, something I had never noticed before, and inside it, a set of documents, old but carefully preserved, along with a small recording device, and as I picked it up, my heart skipped a beat, because I knew this wasn't random. This was something my grandfather had left behind intentionally, something he had hidden in case the truth ever needed to be revealed. And, without wasting a second, I slipped everything into my bag, knowing I couldn't stay any longer, because at any moment, someone could walk in, and as I turned to leave, I heard footsteps approaching, my body tensing instantly as I looked around for a place to hide, and within seconds, I pressed myself against the wall behind the door, holding my breath as it slowly creaked open, and then I heard her voice, my mother, soft but tired, as she stepped into the room. Yahan kia rei gaya hai, she murmured, almost to herself, and I stood there, just inches away from her, hidden yet so close, feeling the weight of everything between us, the lies, the betrayal, the silence, and in that moment, I realized something that changed everything again. They weren't just confident, they were careless, because they believed their lie was complete, that there was no one left to challenge it, no one left to uncover what they had done. And that was their biggest mistake, because I was standing right there, alive, watching, listening, collecting the truth piece by piece, and as she turned to leave the room again, unaware of my presence, I allowed myself one quiet thought, almost like a promise. You took my life without hesitation, now I'm going to take your piece the same way, slowly, silently, until there's nothing left for you to hide behind. And as I slipped out of the house moments later, disappearing into the darkness once again, I knew that this was no longer just about proving I was alive. It was about making sure they felt what it meant to lose everything, just like they thought I had. I didn't stop walking until I was far enough from the house that my heartbeat finally began to slow. But even then, my hands were still shaking, not from fear, but from the weight of what I had just taken. Because as I sat in a quiet corner of a deserted park, the city lights flickering faintly in the distance, I pulled the small recording device and documents out of my bag and stared at them for a long moment, knowing that whatever was inside them had the power to either confirm everything I suspected or change the entire game completely. And with a deep breath, I pressed the play button, and for a second, there was only static, a low hum that made my chest tighten. But then his voice came through, clear, calm, and unmistakable, my grandfather, and the moment I heard him, something inside me cracked again, not in pain this time, but in something deeper, something that felt like strength, because even now, even after everything, he was still guiding me, still protecting me in ways no one else ever had. And as I listened, every word he spoke felt deliberate, as if he knew this moment would come, as if he was speaking directly to me across time. Sana, his voice said softly, if you are hearing this, it means something has gone wrong, or perhaps exactly what I feared has happened. And my grip tightened around the device as I leaned closer, afraid to miss even a single word. I have lived long enough to understand that greed does not always come from strangers. Sometimes it grows quietly within your own home, behind smiles and familiar faces, and if they have tried to take what I left for you, then you must not fight them with anger. You must fight them with truth. And I closed my eyes for a moment, letting his words sink in, because they weren't just advice, they were a strategy, a way forward in a situation that had felt impossible just days ago. And then his voice continued, revealing something I never expected. There are documents, official and sealed, that cannot be altered or erased. I have placed them with someone I trust, someone who will only release them under specific conditions, and if you have reached this point, then you will know what to do. And my heart skipped as I quickly moved to the papers I had found, scanning them with urgency, and there it was, a name, an address, and a set of instructions written in his own handwriting, and suddenly, everything became clearer, because this wasn't just a backup plan, it was a safeguard, designed to expose exactly this kind of betrayal. And as I sat there, processing it all, a strange sense of calm settled over me, because for the first time since this nightmare began, I wasn't just chasing the truth anymore. I was holding it in my hands, but at the same time, another thought began to form, darker and more calculated, because while this evidence could end everything quickly, could bring justice in a matter of days, something inside me resisted that idea, because what they had done to me wasn't quick, it wasn't merciful, it was slow, planned, and deeply personal, and a part of me, the part that had been born the night I was declared dead, didn't just want justice, it wanted them to feel it, too. Experience the same fear, the same uncertainty, the same loss of control that they had forced on me, and that thought scared me for a moment, because I realized how far I had come from the person I used to be, but instead of pushing it away, I accepted it, because sometimes becoming stronger means becoming someone you never thought you could be. And as I looked back down at the documents, a plan began to take shape in my mind, one that wouldn't just expose them, but would slowly dismantle everything they had built on top of their lies, starting with their sense of security, because right now, they believed they were safe. They believed the worst had passed, and that belief was their greatest weakness. So I decided to take it away from them, step by step, beginning with something small, something subtle, something that wouldn't reveal me, but would make them question everything. And within hours, I had set it in motion. Anonymous messages sent from untraceable sources, hints that someone knew the truth, references to details only they would recognize, enough to shake them, but not enough to expose me. And as I imagined their reactions, the confusion, the growing fear, the doubt creeping into their minds, I felt a cold satisfaction settle in my chest, because for the first time, they weren't in control anymore. I was. And as the night grew deeper and the city around me fell into silence, I leaned back against the cold metal bench and allowed myself to breathe, because this was only the beginning, the first step in a much larger plan, one that would lead them exactly where I wanted them to be. And as I closed my eyes for a brief moment, one final thought echoed clearly in my mind. They had taken my name, my identity, my life, but now I was going to take something far more valuable from them, their peace, their certainty, and eventually, everything they thought they had won. It started subtly, almost invisibly, the kind of fear that doesn't arrive with noise but with silence, the kind that slowly seeps into your mind until you can't tell what's real anymore. And I made sure of that, because I didn't want to just expose them. I wanted to break them, piece by piece, the same way they had quietly erased me. And over the next few days, I watched from a distance as my carefully placed moves began to take effect. Anonymous messages appearing at the exact moments they felt most secure. Small details mentioned that only someone close to them could know. Reminders of things they thought were buried. And I could almost see it happening. The way their confidence started to crack. The way their calm began to slip. Because fear doesn't need proof to exist. It only needs doubt. And I was feeding that doubt with precision, making them question not just the situation, but each other. Because betrayal doesn't just destroy trust once, it poisons everything around it. And one evening, as I sat across the street again, hidden behind the familiar shadows, I saw it for the first time, my father shouting, his voice loud and sharp, something I had never seen before in him. Not like this, not this uncontrolled. And my mother, standing there, defensive, her tone rising to match his, accusing, denying, blaming, and even from a distance, I could tell what was happening. The messages were working, the pressure was building, and cracks were turning into fractures. Because when people know they've done something wrong, they don't need evidence to fall apart, they do it on their own. And I stayed there longer than I should have, watching the scene unfold, feeling a strange mix of emotions I couldn't fully explain, because part of me, a small, quiet part, still saw them as my parents, still remembered the moments before everything changed. But that part didn't control me anymore. It couldn't, because the reality of what they had done was far louder, far stronger. And as the argument inside the house grew more intense, I stood up and walked away, not because I couldn't watch anymore, but because I didn't need to. I already knew where this was going. And that night, I took the next step in my plan, something bigger, something that would push them even further. Because fear alone wasn't enough. I needed them to feel consequences, real ones. So I sent a carefully crafted file to a local journalist, anonymous, untraceable, containing just enough information to spark curiosity, hints of a fraudulent death certificate, suspicious property transfers, and possible legal manipulation. Not enough to expose everything, but enough to start a fire. And as expected, within days, whispers began to spread, questions being asked quietly, attention shifting toward their perfectly clean situation. And for the first time, they weren't just dealing with internal fear, they were dealing with external pressure, and I could see it in the way they moved, more cautious, more tense, constantly looking over their shoulders as if expecting something to happen at any moment. And that was exactly what I wanted, because the more unstable they became, the easier it would be to bring everything down at once. But even as I watched all of this unfold, I didn't lose focus on the bigger picture, because this wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about control, about making sure that when the truth finally came out, It wouldn't just be accepted, it would be undeniable, and that meant I had to be patient, had to resist the urge to end it quickly, no matter how tempting it was, because real consequences aren't rushed. They are built, slowly, carefully, until there's no way to escape them. And as I sat alone in my room that night, the faint glow of the city lights casting shadows on the walls, I took out my grandfather's letter again, reading it silently, grounding myself in his words, because even now, even in the middle of all this darkness, I knew I couldn't lose myself completely. I couldn't become just like them, and that balance, that line between justice and something darker, was the only thing keeping me from going too far. But at the same time, I couldn't ignore the truth either. They had crossed that line without hesitation, and now, they were going to face what that really meant. And as I placed the letter back down and leaned against the wall, closing my eyes for a brief moment, one clear thought settled in my mind. They were already breaking, they just didn't know it yet. And when they finally realized what was happening, when the full weight of the truth came crashing down on them, it wouldn't just destroy their lives, it would destroy them. The moment they realized I might still be alive wasn't loud or dramatic. It didn't come with a scream or a sudden revelation. It came quietly, like a shadow slipping into a room they thought was completely secure, and I knew exactly when it happened, because I saw it in their faces, in the way my father froze mid-step as he read the message on his phone, his expression shifting from irritation to something far more dangerous. Fear, real fear, the kind that grips you when a truth you buried starts clawing its way back to the surface. And my mother, standing just behind him, noticed it instantly, her voice low but tense as she asked what was wrong, and for a few seconds, he didn't respond, just stared at the screen as if it might change if he looked long enough. But it didn't, because the message was simple, direct, and impossible to ignore. Dead people don't remember the night you signed the papers. And I had chosen those words carefully, because they weren't just a threat. They were a memory, a specific moment only someone present could know. And as I watched from across the street, hidden once again in the shadows that had become my second home, I saw something shift between them, something fragile breaking completely, because doubt had officially turned into realization, and realization is far more dangerous than fear, because once you know something might be true, you can't go back to pretending it isn't. And within minutes, the tension inside the house exploded. Voices raised, accusations thrown back and forth, my father demanding answers, my mother denying everything, both of them trying to find someone else to blame for a situation they had created together. And it was almost surreal to watch, because for so long, they had been united in their deception, perfectly aligned in their plan. But now, under pressure, that unity was falling apart, revealing the cracks that had always been there. And for the first time since this began, I allowed myself to feel something close to satisfaction, not joy, not happiness, but a quiet, controlled acknowledgement that everything was working exactly the way I had planned. But I didn't let it distract me, because this was also the most dangerous point in the entire process. The moment when people realize they're losing control is the moment they become unpredictable, desperate, and capable of making reckless decisions. And I couldn't afford to underestimate that, so I stayed careful, stayed hidden, observing every move they made, every reaction, every shift in their behavior, because now, it wasn't just about gathering evidence or creating pressure. It was about anticipating what they might do next. And as the night went on, I saw it happen, the decision forming silently between them, my father grabbing his keys, his movements sharp and urgent, my mother following closely behind, her face pale but determined, and without thinking twice, I moved, keeping my distance as I followed their car. Through the dimly lit streets, my mind racing with possibilities, because wherever they were going, it wasn't random, it was connected to the truth they were trying to protect. And after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, they stopped in front of a small, unremarkable building, the kind you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it. And as they stepped out, I stayed back, watching carefully as they entered. And something about the place felt familiar, something I couldn't immediately place. But it didn't take long before it clicked. It was connected to the lawyer, the same one I had been investigating, the same one who had played a role in all of this. And in that moment, everything aligned perfectly, because this wasn't just a reaction. It was a move, an attempt to fix the situation before it spiraled out of control. And I knew what that meant. They were going to try and cover their tracks, to erase any remaining evidence, to reinforce the lie before it collapsed completely. And that realization sent a sharp surge of urgency through me, because if they succeeded, everything I had built so far could be at risk. But instead of panicking, I focused, because this was exactly why I had been preparing, exactly why I had taken my time instead of rushing. And without hesitation, I reached for my phone and activated the next part of my plan, the one I had been saving for the right moment, because if they were going to make a move, then so was I. And as I watched the door close behind them, one thought echoed clearly in my mind. This was it, the turning point, the moment where everything would either fall apart or finally come together. And as I stepped back into the darkness, ready to follow through with what came next, I allowed myself one final realization. They didn't just suspect anymore, they knew. And now that they knew I was alive, the game had officially changed. Because this was no longer about a dead girl fighting for her life. This was about a truth that refused to stay buried, no matter how hard they tried to hide it. The next morning, I woke with a sense of purpose sharper than anything I had ever felt before, because now they knew I was alive, and that knowledge had turned the entire game into a high-stakes trap, and I knew I had to act carefully, every move deliberate, every step calculated, because the tiniest mistake could undo months of preparation. And I started by organizing everything I had gathered so far, the documents from my grandfather's study, the recordings, the digital evidence, every timestamp, every anomaly in the hospital records, every tiny hint that showed their deception, and I realized something important. This wasn't just evidence, it was a weapon, the kind of weapon that doesn't need bullets to hurt, the kind that strikes silently but leaves permanent damage. And I began sharing carefully selected pieces of it with the right people, anonymous tips to journalists, subtle leaks to authorities, carefully worded messages that suggested the possibility of fraud without revealing myself. And within hours, the first effects were visible. Whispers of investigation began circulating around their legal team, questions were being asked, phone calls were made, and suddenly, the perfect world they had created was crumbling. Because nothing destroys confidence faster than uncertainty, and as I watched from a distance, I saw them beginning to panic, my father pacing, my mother clinging to explanations, their carefully rehearsed narratives unraveling, and I smiled, quietly to myself, because this was exactly what I wanted. I wasn't just reclaiming what was mine, I was making them live through the same fear, doubt, and helplessness they had forced on me, and as the day turned to evening, I moved to the next phase of my plan. Direct confrontation without revealing my identity fully yet, planting incontrovertible evidence in places only they could find, emails sent to their closest allies, hidden notes slipped into files they thought secure, subtle but undeniable proof that their actions were being tracked, that the world could see what they had done. And as the night approached, I knew the final pieces were in place, because I had created a network of pressure points that would collapse their lie completely. And I didn't even need to be present to watch the panic spread, the fear of exposure, the tension between them, the subtle accusing glances, the whispered arguments behind closed doors. It was happening naturally, organically, exactly the way I had planned, and for the first time in months, I allowed myself a sense of calm, because I wasn't reacting anymore, I was orchestrating, and the best part was, they couldn't even see me. Couldn't even guess that the girl they had declared dead was the one controlling the unraveling of their world. And as I sat quietly in the corner of my room, reviewing every step I had taken, I realized something important. Revenge isn't about violence. It isn't about shouting or breaking things. It's about control. And right now, I had control over everything that mattered, over the narrative, over the perception, over the fear they had always underestimated. And I knew that the final step, when it came, would be inevitable, because the truth, when it has been patiently and deliberately prepared, cannot be stopped. And as I leaned back, closing my eyes for a moment, one thought echoed in my mind, clear and unwavering. They had taken my life on paper, my identity, my peace. But now, every lie they had built would crumble, and I would be there to witness it, alive, unshaken, and more dangerous than they could ever imagine. By the 9th day, everything I had set in motion began collapsing their carefully constructed world, and it wasn't loud, it wasn't sudden, it was insidious, slow, like a shadow creeping into a room until the walls themselves seemed to bend under pressure, because the subtle hints I had planted, the anonymous tips, the undeniable evidence, the little pieces of truth only they could recognize, had taken root, and now they were panicking, frantically trying to salvage the illusion of control that had always given them comfort. And from my hidden vantage point, I watched as my father's hands shook while scanning emails he shouldn't have received, as my mother's face turned pale when her colleagues questioned the documents she had forged, and the perfect smiles they had worn so effortlessly for months were gone, replaced by fear and accusation, because for the first time, they were aware of the full weight of what they had done, and it was unstoppable. And then came the moment I had been waiting for, the one that would confirm everything, a formal investigation notice arriving at their door, legal representatives knocking with questions they couldn't answer, and the realization hit them like a physical blow, their fraudulent death certificate, the property theft, the lies they had whispered behind closed doors, all exposed, all undeniable, and I watched as my mother's voice broke during her phone call, trying to explain, justify, manipulate, but the walls had ears now, the law had eyes, the world had started noticing, and my father, rigid and proud, suddenly crumbled, the first tears I had ever imagined him shedding for anything other than himself, and in that moment, I felt something I hadn't expected, a strange mix of satisfaction and melancholy, because even as I claimed victory, I knew how deeply betrayal can scar a person, how it leaves marks beyond revenge, how it changes everyone involved, and I let myself think for a second about the old Sanaa, the daughter, who had been erased on paper, the girl who had been betrayed by the people she loved most, and I realized she wasn't gone. She had evolved into something stronger, sharper, more resilient, and yet, she carried that pain with her, as fuel for every step, every plan, every silent move she had made, and as I observed the chaos consuming the house, the arguments, the fear, the desperation, I knew the final act was near, because exposing them wasn't enough, they needed to feel the consequences of their actions fully, and now, there was no way back, no room to hide, and with a calm I hadn't felt in months, I prepared the final pieces, the documents my grandfather had hidden, the recordings, every shred of evidence that could completely reclaim my life and demolish theirs, because this wasn't just about property or legality anymore. It was about justice, truth, and reclaiming the identity they had stolen. And as I sat back, my heart steady, watching the final collapse unfold in real time, one thing became crystal clear. They had built a perfect lie, a house of cards, and now, with me alive and ready, it was falling, and nothing they did could stop it. The morning sunlight streamed weakly through the blinds, but I barely noticed it, because for the first time in months, I felt a clarity I hadn't known since my grandfather's passing, a clarity born from the fact that the truth, long hidden and carefully manipulated against me, was finally ready to take its course, and as I sat at my desk, surrounded by the collected documents, recordings, timestamps, and legal evidence I had painstakingly gathered, I allowed myself to finally plan the final move, the one that would not only reclaim my life, my property, my identity, but also deliver the silent, unshakable justice my parents and their accomplices had tried so desperately to avoid. And I started with the lawyer, the one who had orchestrated much of the legal deception, because if I could make him accountable, unraveling the fraud would be easier. And it wasn't hard, because people like him never anticipate being outsmarted. And within hours, with carefully anonymous emails, untraceable calls, and hidden recordings of conversations he had thought were private, I exposed his involvement to the authorities, creating undeniable proof that the fraudulent death certificate and the property transfers were not just family disputes, but part of a larger conspiracy. And as the legal wheels began to turn against him, I moved to the house, my old home, now the center of betrayal and fear. But I didn't enter like a victim or even like the daughter they had tried to erase. I entered like someone who had been resurrected, someone who had returned not for mercy but for reckoning. And the moment I walked through the front door, the air changed, heavy with tension, because they sensed it immediately, the presence of someone alive who should have been dead. My father stiffened, my mother's hands trembled, and their eyes, those eyes that once saw me as a nuisance, a problem, a name to remove from legal records, widened with recognition and terror, and I let them look at Me for a long moment, letting the realization sink in fully, because seeing the daughter they had declared dead standing before them was more powerful than any accusation I could have made. And then I began, calmly, deliberately, recounting everything, step by step, the disappearance of my documents, the bank transactions I never authorized, the fraudulent death certificate, the property transfer, the manipulation of legal authorities, and the carefully orchestrated betrayal by the people who were supposed to protect me, my voice steady, unshaken, carrying every ounce of the pain, anger, and disappointment I had held inside for months. And as I spoke, they tried to defend themselves, to explain, to manipulate the narrative, but it was too late. The evidence was irrefutable. The witnesses and proof I had secured made every excuse meaningless, and I watched the walls of their lies crumble, the facade of their perfect control shattering with each word I spoke. And I didn't stop there. I produced my grandfather's letter, the recordings, the sealed documents, everything he had left for me in case the day came when I would need to fight. And as they realized that nothing could change the truth now, panic replaced denial, confusion replaced authority, and the air between us thickened with the weight of consequences, because they had underestimated not just me, but the fact that I had survived, grown stronger, and become something they could not contain. And then I laid out the final part of the reckoning, the legal claims, the exposure to media, the irreversible transfers back to my name, everything calculated to reclaim not just what was mine, but to strip away the arrogance and control they had abused for so long. And as the reality of their actions dawned fully upon them, my father fell silent, my mother's voice shook, and I saw fear like I had never seen before, not for themselves as individuals, but for everything they had built on lies, everything that depended on deception, everything they had stolen, and it was mine to give back, piece by piece, in the form of undeniable truth. And in that moment, I realized that this wasn't just victory, it was transformation, because the girl they had tried to erase, the daughter they had declared dead, was no longer defined by their betrayal. She was defined by her own strength, her intelligence, her resilience, and the truth she had unearthed and wielded as power. And as I stood there, observing their faces, contort with realization, guilt, and helplessness, I felt a strange, quiet relief, because justice had been served, but not in a way that required me to become like them. It was served in a way that only I could, silently, patiently, and completely. And after the lawyers confirmed the reversal of property, after the authorities acknowledged the fraudulent acts, after the media quietly reported on a legal anomaly uncovered, I stepped out into the light, breathing freely for the first time in months, feeling the air of my grandfather's house, my home again, and I allowed myself a small, satisfied smile, because the reckoning was complete, the truth had risen, and the people who had tried to bury me in a paper death had finally understood the cost of their actions. And as I walked up the staircase to the room that had once been mine, now restored fully to my name and my life, I felt the weight of months lift from my shoulders, the fear, the isolation, the pain, replaced by something stronger, a profound sense of liberation and triumph. And I thought back to the moments before it all began, the tea I had made in my small apartment, the feeling of being erased from my own life, and I realized that every tear, every sleepless night, every plan and every careful move had led to this one moment. And finally, I allowed myself to speak aloud, softly, as if to no one but the universe. You tried to bury me, but you forgot that seeds grow underground. And with that, I stepped out, onto the balcony, sunlight warming my face, breathing in the city I had once hidden from, knowing fully that I had returned, alive, unbroken, victorious, and with every truth now in my hands, I felt the kind of peace that only comes after betrayal. Fear and darkness have been conquered completely, because I wasn't just alive. I was free, and the people who tried to destroy me had finally learned what it truly meant to face the consequences of their lies.